Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. Right, so after I did my 8.2 exploration, actually quite few of you messaged me directly asking what were my overall Act 8.2 MVPs. And this time, for the first time ever, there wasn't really a great single kind of answer, because one thing that I did like about Act 8.2 more so than about Act 8.1 or 7.4 or 7.3 was the fact that it was quite well diversified, and in terms of champions that you needed to use, you basically kind of had to vary quite a lot. It wasn't necessarily just Herc goes brr kind of lane, or Magneto destroys all the bosses and stuff like that. So you did have to use quite a lot of different champions, but obviously there were still some champions that kept repeating themselves time and time again. And keep in mind, this is based on my personal experience. I'm not saying there aren't other great options. I'm not saying that even all of the champions I mentioned are necessarily the best for everybody. These are the champions that I relied on the most exploring Act 8.2, and these were my MVPs. You might have different ones. It doesn't mean that I'm saying that your champions and your options are, worse or something like that. Not at all. Whatever works for you, if you have explored it already, or what will work for you, great. That's good for you. This video is about what worked for me and the champions that I relied on the most. And as I said, there wasn't a single champion that really stood out. Like in many previous chapters, whether there was Kingpin and King Groot or Hercules or something. This time around, it really wasn't the case, aside from Science Class in general. And if I would have to give like one specific champion from Science Class that was the MVP, I'd probably say Scorpion, because there were a ton of path where you could use Scorpion even if he wasn't quote unquote the intended class, due to the fact that he had access to shock or access to poison, and also the fact that he's a science champion that can easily place like 4 debuffs in order to work for those weapon nodes. He also doesn't gain any buffs naturally or has the ability to block unblockable. And yeah, he just worked out quite phenomenal. He worked for the Torn's path for many of the weapons nodes, and he has great block proficiency, so he was good for a lot of the retaliate stuff. And in general, I was so confident in Scorpion that quite often I actually brought in his synergy with Agent Venom or Venom, just so he gets that even further damage increase, and he just blitzed through a ton of lanes. I think I probably used him in at least like 7 or 8, or maybe 9 lanes even, which is by far the most. So overall, I would say that probably Scorpion was the MVP of 8.2, all things considered. Closely followed by Titania, and my Titania is rank 3, but he definitely did some crazy things as well, and that was quite awesome. Human Torch obviously was still useful. Anti-Venom actually became surprisingly useful for a bunch of retaliate stuff and a few other things. So I was quite happy with that. But obviously there are more science champions like that can work very well for plenty of situations there. Void would be another, or like Overseer, Spider Ham, or Mr. Fantastic and Mr. Negative, and Joe Fixit and I-Bomb. But yeah, overall, I'd say Science Class were the MVPs in general. Then in Skill Class, obviously, we need to take a look at Kingpin. Kingpin did work reasonably well also for some of those stagger lanes. You could combine him with Hood and then use him for that Frostbite lane if you chose to. Obviously, he was the best option and the safest option against the final boss as well. So from Skill Class, I would have to say that Kingpin is probably the best. Followed by Nick Fury. Nick Fury was also quite helpful because his debuff shrugging abilities are still quite reliable, and access to a ton of bleed effects definitely, can be quite useful. But other than that, skill class, I did use other champions, Shang-Chi, Mulman, something like that, but Nick Fury and Kingpin were definitely 2 of the most used skill champions, I'd say. In Mutant class, Archangel was always there for like a good problem-solving session, so I didn't necessarily clear entire lanes with him, but he definitely did come in handy to have. And other than that, besides Archangel, I would say that Toad was the MVP of Mutant class for me. And again, mine was rank 3, but even as a rank 3, he did a ton of things. There is that mutant lane in 8.26, where he worked together fantastic with Sunspot. And then there were the mutant regeneration lanes, where obviously Toad does have access to regen, so he could gain damage there. And yeah, overall, I think Toad was one of the more useful mutants alongside Archangel. And then obviously Kitty saw some gameplay as well as Bishop. Bishop was also quite useful for that regen lane. He can be used for the final boss as well, by the way. And then obviously there's Kitty. From tech class, I think it's Nimrod and Omega Sentinel. They worked especially well as a duo, which was the most important thing with that Nimrod synergy, where whenever any hit from the opponent's special attack does not make contact with Omega Sentinel, she inflicts them with a shock passive over 6 seconds. And that worked like a charm for a ton of shock vulnerability lanes, stuff like that. So yes, Nimrod and Omega Sentinel individually were awesome too for several lanes, but definitely as a synergy team, both of them put in a ton of work for me. Super happy about that. Obviously, Warlock was still there to be quite useful for a bunch of aggression regen stuff, and retaliate. I actually used Rocket for I think like 3 paths, so Rocket definitely kind of made a positive impression on me as well for a while there. So Rocket definitely had its place. And in Cosmic class, moving on to Cosmics, I think it definitely was Hulkling as the MVP, followed by Herc, Angela, and Null and Odin. So Odin was more important than most people realize because there were a ton of nodes effectively that reward you for having access to more unique buffs. And obviously Odin does have a ton of buffs in his kit, so he was useful in it himself, but he also made a ton of other champions much better. So there are a lot of those weapon nodes where your potency of your effect gets increased for each unique buff. There was also that KVQ node from the Cosmic Champions where you needed more unique buffs in order to gain the vigilance, in order to stop yourself from faltering or missing when you are faltered. And yeah, Odin and having Odin's pre-fights was more important in 8.2 than pretty much in any of the other previous story content. So even if you don't have one ranked, as long as you have at least a 5-star, obviously that's helpful. But being able to bring in Odin, who is in itself a useful champion for those lanes, and then making like your Hercules or your Hyperion or something else much more deadly was definitely well worth it. But yeah, Null kind of went hand in hand with a ton of the debuff nodes. He was quite good for, I believe, that Torn's lane as well, obviously, as with the weapon nodes where you needed to inflict debuffs in order to deactivate those weapons. You obviously could choose them with Titania, but Null worked fantastic for a bunch of that stuff. And yeah, Angela at a relatively high sig was great, especially because there were few opponents like Iceman to kind of like bypass that frostbite. And then obviously Herc is a Herc. And then in the final class, as Mystics, I honestly used Juggernaut more than I thought I would. Juggernaut was quite good for me because of his random nullify and easy intercepts for me for sure. And then Tigra, Doctor Doom, and Absorbing Man were kind of like the main Mystics overall that I would say. I used Longshot a fair bit as well. But yeah, so that is pretty much it. I wanted to keep this video kind of relatively short and concise. And yet again, I do want to explain that obviously there will be other champions. And I myself used, Quicksilver also for more stuff than I thought I would. Or Spider Ham. And in skill class, obviously, I did some stuff with Black Cat. But in general, I tried my best to kind of like highlight the champions that I kept using time and time again. And, part of this will inevitably be personal preference. Like, I'm 1000% sure if you like Elsa Bloodstone, she is quite good for several lanes there, or Crossbones, for instance, or perhaps Blade. Black Panther was one of my recommendations for a ton of fights as well, due to his kind of like easily accessible shrug of abilities and so on and so forth. So there will be variances, and there will obviously be other options than just the ones that I highlight. But yeah, overall, so just to kind of like quickly go over, Scorpion was overall the biggest MVP in my opinion. Then Titania, Human Torch, Anti-Venom, Kingpin, Nick Fury, Archangel, Toad was kind of like a surprise hero of 8.2. Kitty, Meg Sentinel, Nimrod, especially Synergy Team, Warlock, Rocket, Hulkling, Hercules, Angela, Null, Odin, Jugs, Tigra, Doom, and Absman would be kind of like my short list of personal MVPs. Let me know which champion shined for you, whether you agree with my picks or not, and I will catch you guys soon. Bye. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about